Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina.
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on silence in the age of noise. We're not copywriting this
Yet
author,
again.
but I read Silence in the Age of Noise by Erling Kegge, and I was so inspired, and I really wanted to do an episode on silence and
The brain.
also silence on the brain.
And Carolina recommended the book. But yeah, it was fascinating. Something I found interesting is the word noise actually originates from the Latin root of nausea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, obviously meaning, like pain and disturbance. And this is not to say that noise is all bad. I'm also a huge lover of music. This was really interesting, and I think the importance of silence is something we should all be reminded of.
Yeah, so in this book, he uses so many different examples, and I'm not gonna give away the whole book because I feel like everyone should read it or listen to it. He talks about how he asks what is silence and why it's more important now than ever. And I think it's so important in this day and age, not only because we're constantly bombarded with sensory stimuli, not only audio but also visual. We're constantly checking our messages, notifications, little dings going off, the radio, the cars, everything. People pay thousands to go on retreats, yoga retreats, and to just get away from the noise. And
yeah, silence retreats are becoming are like a really big thing.
yeah, and I think it's so important to find a way to find silence within ourselves. But I think the fact that we have, as a society, moved towards louder and noisier and busier and more productive states is in a way running away from ourselves. So
Exactly.
running away from our inner states and inner thoughts. Well, thoughts.
Yeah. Our outer thoughts.
Yes.
Because I think it's important to mention that the author, Erling Kegge, is a mountaineer?
Yeah, so he's an explorer.
An explorer, yeah. And there was a quote in the book that really stuck out to me where he was describing his experience of exploring Antarctica. And he said, "The quieter I became, the more I heard. I became an extension of my surroundings. I began a conversation with nature." And I think that is beautiful. And also, nature also probably includes himself, because, of course, when there is external silence, there is still internal noise.
Yeah.
Your default mode network and your default thoughts just circling in your head.
Yeah, and in a way of like we are an extension of nature, but
Exactly.
I think we feel so detached, and noise is a way to create this detachment, which allows us to enter into this dopamine loop where we are never satisfied and we always want more.
And it's because the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is a chemical that signals reward, it actually increases it increases in rewarding situations, but the peak of dopamine is not the reward itself, but the anticipation towards it. And this is why we constantly seek new rewards, because we're never truly fulfilled, both biologically, like through this neurophysiological mechanism, but also behaviorally and psychologically.
Yeah, so interesting how we then end up just falling into this trap. And so
they call it the hedonic wheel.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so stopping and trying to be mindful of what you're doing and be mindful of the stimuli you're allowing yourself to perceive is a way to help stop this dopamine loop. And I think it's almost scary the way that we are so dependent on it, and the way that we are so afraid of like our own thoughts. So there was this experiment conducted where people received an electric shock.
This is so interesting.
Yeah.
I was so surprised. I was like, that's definitely not going to be me.
Yeah.
Sorry, too early. Go on and explain it first.
Yes. Thanks for the little prelude.
Ooh, what could it be?
Yeah. So the experiment was basically they gave their participants a choice of a electric shock versus sitting alone in silence for, what was it, 15 minutes? Something like that? Yeah, so just over 50% of people chose the shock, which that statistic in itself speaks volume. And then there was one person who chose the shock
like 120 times.
Yeah, it was insane. So I would not.
I think that person.
I don't want to know what his thoughts
therapy.
are. But when it gets to the point that the majority of the population is choosing physical pain over being alone with your own thoughts,
yeah,
I mean, that speaks volumes, you know?
I love that language. Indeed, it does.
So, yeah, I think that emphasizes how important silence is and how we're so afraid of silence. And there's this quote by an interaction he had with the poet Jon Fosser, a Norwegian poet, saying that there is a love no one remembers. And this could potentially be about silence, which the author Erling Kegge inquired about. And the Norwegian poet replied to him saying that silence, in a way, it is the silence that speaks.
Yeah, and this is related to what many people often describe of God being in the silence.
Yes.
There was a story he described of a student inquiring to his guru what is Brahman, which is the greater consciousness and the ultimate God in Hinduism.
Yeah.
In Hinduism. And the teacher just stayed completely silent and, tried to describe it to a student in terms of just being in silence. And I think this also speaks a lot about the limits of language. And and obviously noise consists of more than just language, but to humans, language is a huge part of the noise that we're constantly perceiving. Some things just can't be described in words. And it's better described in silence, which is utilized a lot in music. In music composition, or even art forms like film. One of my favorite film directors is Federico Fellini, and something I noticed immediately from watching a couple of his films when I was first introduced to his work was his use of silence. Like, he utilizes music really well, but I think he utilizes silence even more in order to emphasize the music. This also is actually linked to the neuroscience of how we perceive sound. Studies have shown that, for example, by Scholl et al. In 2010, they carried out a study which was on mice in response to sound, and they measured the activity of neurons throughout the auditory cortex, which of course responds to sound, and also associated areas. And they found that the onset of sound activates neurons, but when this sound is continued, the neurons stop being active. And so this shows that neurons actually signal change in noise, but not to noise or to silence specifically. And so the event that they respond to is when a sound starts or when a sound stops, which I find it's not really intuitive, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
This is similar to the idea that that's, like I was saying, silence is heightened by contrast in sound. I mean, silence is in a way the contrast to sound.
Yes.
Which is more of a baseline in a way than silence is. Like, it seems almost that the baseline is noise, and the
contrast.
The contrast is the silence.
Yeah.
In such a noisy world, exactly. And an interesting study which was published quite long ago in 2006 by Bernardi et al. in the journal Heart, actually, so it's not really neuroscience, but they found that silence for 2 minutes is actually more relaxing than so-called relaxing music. So music was found to induce an overall arousal effect on the body, namely like the heart rate, an increase in heart rate, which was also related to the tempo or the speed of the music. And Of course, as we all know, slow or meditative music was able to induce a relaxing effect physiologically in the body, but they found that this effect was even more evident during pauses or silences. And of course, this relates to our experiential knowledge of meditation or Kegge's experiences of exploring silent landscapes like Antarctica all alone. How this can induce relaxation in a way.
Yeah, so silence, as we've mentioned, is a way to be present with yourself. And another way that I think this comes across in our day to day, silence is can also be perceived as a luxury. And so it can create a class divide between those who can afford silence and those who have to endure it due to bad housing insulation, due to difficult work hours, etc., etc.
Or just forced urbanization in our modern world, where a lot of people are turning to cities to create a living, but this is not necessarily beneficial to our mental health. But it's the necessary reality, necessity. Yeah.
There's a couple quotes that he says that I really like that I would just like to mention here. So he says that if you listen, there's something being said to you, and that is what you write down. So this is in reference to poetry and or writing down, and how in order to write good poetry, you need to listen to what is being said. So listen to the silence. And throughout this book, there's this theme of using silence to listen to yourself, and how you are the greatest book you'll ever read, and how you are this puzzle that you are uncovering, and you can only do that when you listen to yourself and your thoughts, and this can only happen when you allow yourself to have silence.
Oh, I think this is so interesting in relation to another episode we've done on reductionism, because it's the idea of so that episode was on reductionism in art and visual perception, but it's the same idea that your brain, through top-down processes or introspective processes, thoughts and imagination and inference making, creates its own reality. And when there's more of a blank slate, it does this more so. So, and interestingly, this has been shown through neuroscience studies as well, because I'm sure we've all experienced, listening to a piece of music and you turn it off, and you then realize that it's actually continuing to play in your own head. This was literally happening to me today. I've been hyper aware of my auditory stimuli and that's reaching my brain, and and having more silence in my life, and also especially, as I mentioned, being somebody who's always having music. Today I was listening to a song probably 10 times on repeat, and then I just stopped it, and I swear it played 10 more times in my head. And I just kept thinking of this study by David Kramer et al. In 2005, where they played music to people that was either familiar or unfamiliar, and then they stopped it at moments so that there were silent gaps within the music, and they recorded activity from the auditory cortex again, but in humans. They found that muting short gaps of familiar music was able to still result in auditory activation in the brain, and this signifies auditory imagery, which was confirmed by the subjects' descriptions of their experiences of having the music play in their head. I mean, it's really interesting that there's a physical correspondence of this in the brain's activity, this phenomenon. And also music that had lyrics, which requires more semantic knowledge of the music, higher level processing in a way of the language on top of just the melody or the music. This music with lyrics resulted in imagery, so activation of also auditory association cortices, which also is expected. So these are the areas that are more involved in processing the meaning of sound rather than just the sound itself.
So interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is just a great reminder of the brain's imaginative power and how even when we're imagining, the same or the similar neural activity is happening as when we're processing inputs, raw inputs.
Yeah, and that's the same with memory. So memory recall is reactivating these same neurons.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Silence is also another way in that he describes in a book to perhaps access infinity. So in the sense that we're constantly
with the sense of time.
Yeah. In the sense that we're constantly like running after our own personalized schedules, and most of us are usually late, and silence is a way to simply, I don't know, suspend time and to be present in the moment.
I found that so interesting, how noise, or I suppose all sensory inputs, but noise can alter our sense of time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I usually do that. I time my walk to uni or whatever by the number of songs and things like that.
Yeah, same. I definitely do that.
Yeah. About time, there's a quote by William Blake that he mentions, which I'd also like to mention, which is, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour."
Wow, I loved that. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I suppose practicing silence can alter your sense of time.
Yeah, your perspective on time.
Your perspective, yeah. I wanted to mention something about the therapeutic uses of silence as well. So we've mentioned silence retreats, which I think are effective, but of course also maybe you don't have to pay money.
Yeah.
Well, as we were saying, silence can be a luxury.
Yeah.
But if you can also just find, silence in your own space, then it can be as effective. Neuroscientifically, I found a fascinating study by Kirst et al. In 2013, who found that 2 hours of silence a day can actually promote the development of new neurons in the brain. So a process called neurogenesis, which is controversial in adult humans, but it has been proven to a certain extent. And what they found was that they compared white noise, they compared noise, and they compared silence. And then they assessed the development of new neurons following this. And they found that after 7 days, silence was the only stimuli, I guess you could say, that increased the number of neurons, which I think was so unexpected, because usually neurogenesis you would think is induced by
learning.
Yeah, or so enhancement of the environment, environmental enrichment is what they call it.
Perhaps silence is the environmental enrichment.
Exactly. I mean, it could have an indirect effect in that, firstly, it could be that the I think this is what they suggested as well. Yeah, that neurogenesis is an adaptive response to silence. So it's like a homeostatic mechanism where a lack of input, so the neurons are basically like, oh my gosh, there's no input. Let's make more neurons so that we can detect more of it.
Yeah. Or maybe the brain just needed a breather.
Yeah. So I think this is a valid explanation. Of course, more research has to be done to determine what the actual cause is, or maybe it doesn't need to be done and we can just accept the fact. But yeah, I thought it was just really interesting.
That is really interesting. Yeah.
It's just really unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This isn't very scientific, but it just really moved me. I remember last year, I can't remember, but I don't watch. There's this British show called Dancing with the Stars.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't really watch
British?
it. I think so.
Okay. I don't really watch it either. Can you tell?
Yeah. But I remember I watched this video clip of one of like the final dance performances, and it moved me so much because there was the professional dancer, and then there was the artist he was dancing with, who I unfortunately don't know the name, but I'm sure you can easily find it online. And she's deaf, so when they were dancing, they did half the song with sound, and the next half they cut the sound, and they were still dancing. And I don't know why, but it touched me so much because it's her perspective of the dance and of the world with the lack of sound.
Wow.
Yeah.
That, I think it's really interesting. Even like was mentioned in the book, Beethoven, who became deaf over time and continued to compose even more magnificent music.
Yeah.
It just speaks to the power of sensory imagination.
Yes.
And I was actually thinking about Claude Monet because he developed cataract, I think it was.
Yes.
And his sense of vision diminished over time. And then this led to him, becoming one of the greatest impressionists known to us, and his famous lily ponds and lily pond paintings.
Yeah.
And again, relating to reductionism in visual art. I guess that's a kind of different though. That's why I was hesitant to.
No, but it is similar because it's about the removal of the stimuli and how the imagination can still fill in the gaps. The
imagination takes over, and
the top-down processes are expressed.
Exactly. And in art, it's through both the artist and the audience. Yeah. Wow.
And on that note, we would like to end this episode on silence.